grabbing things off of shelves that I had on the Renaissance. I read Inventing the Renaissance by Ada Palmer is probably the best book I've read this year.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics, as always, is Robert Morse. How are you this time?
Oh, I'm doing great, Rory. How are things with you?
Things are fine, fairly uneventful, which is what I like. But my car passed the MOT, which is our vehicle check once a year to make sure it's fine.
Well, that's exciting. That's
Despite my foray into the infamous Ballymena.
Oh, I never really thought about that. You're a European with a car, and I'm an American without one.
Yes.
That's crazy.
And I also own a gun, and I don't think you do.
I definitely don't. I didn't. You can own a gun in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, in Northern Ireland's weird. I think you can have any caliber you want as long as it's bolt action. And the police have guns here.
So Northern Ireland is the one part of the UK you can have a gun in?
You can have guns in Britain, but because of Dunblane, which was a man shot up a primary school, everyone just went nope. So there's tight restrictions on it. There's still tight restrictions here, but they're just sort of slightly strange. It's just a shotgun, so nothing too exotic. And
I did not know that you can have a gun in Northern Ireland, but not most of the UK. That's interesting.
It is difficult, but yeah. And I drive a pickup for work.
Good gosh!
So I'm living
You were just smashing the stereotypes.
Yes, and you live in a very walkable city with trains.
I sure do. I sure do. It's crazy.
Do you think our New York's in a golden age?
Yes, definitely in a golden age. I think honestly, and I sort of started out the YouTube channel talking about this, that like we really are in a golden age, and despite the cavalcade of horror that I've covered on this channel over the past, I guess it's like coming up on 14, 15 years now. I still believe that, actually. I think it's extraordinary the number of problems that we have solved, the number of obstacles that have been surmounted. If you go back 10 years, you can find things that are worse and things that are better. If you go back 50 years, you can find things that are worse, things that are better. If you go back 100 years, it's everything's better. And if you go back 200 years, 300 years, it just gets exponentially better and better and better. And one of the great joys of studying history is the way that it can all sort of hang together as a story. And I firmly believe in the idea of progress and the fact that things have been getting better and continuously getting better for a while. And it's why I get so frustrated when I see backsliding, when I see us making decisions, taking actions that are unnecessary and or entirely counterproductive and function
recreating the SS.
Yes, exactly. Recreating the American Gestapo and the Department of Homeland Security. I see these things as counterproductive and infuriating. And perhaps because I've been so infuriated over the past couple months, the new Trump administration, the genocide in Gaza, I have really done a bit of a deep dive on the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, and just sort of...
Is that because you were wanting to know about the original Doge?
I mean, honestly, it started because I was in a bookshop and I had some time to kill. And I came upon this book that I'm now recommending to everybody I meet, which is called Inventing the Renaissance by Ada Palmer. And that sort of set me in a direction of grabbing things off of shelves that I had on the Renaissance. I read, so Inventing the Renaissance by Ada Palmer is probably the best book I've read this year. A World Lit Only by Fire by William Manchester is definitely the worst book I have read this year. Like, just unbelievably bad.
So that's basically the Industrial Revolution that started in Manchester, England?
What's that?
Is that what that book's about?
No, it's William Manchester is the author.
That's his name. It's not about Manchester. Okay.
Of a book on the Renaissance. And it's fascinating because Ada Palmer does, I think it would be inappropriate to say that she does a debunking of the Renaissance, but what she does is she
zooms out, would that be? Like, sort of says, like, what really is a golden age? And why do people frame it in that sense?
Absolutely. And she at the same time provides like the best history of what I would sort of characterize as like the later Renaissance in Italy or
Hmm.
whatever that I've ever read, but also just like a broader sense of like, why do we romanticize this? Why do we look at it the way that we do?
Because you
And then
sent me an interview with her, and I thought it's like 2 hours or something, and I was like, this is going to be a bit dry. But it was mostly her being like, "What is a golden age?" People just make them up because they like the sound of it, or they have
exactly.
a political agenda to push. So quite often it's like, "Oh, this pushes capitalism. That's what we'll do. This pushes communism. This is what we'll say is a golden age." So I feel like golden ages are very personal. It would seem.
Hmm. Oh, for sure. Well, they're personal in that, everyone can have their own estimation, their own and I think by the end of this podcast, it should be clear that I agree with Ada Palmer in many respects, but maybe disagree with her in some others, because I actually do have some sympathy to this overarching narrative that puts, Renaissance Italy as the start of something important in sort of European, American, and world history. But, like, her book is just such a delight because she's very careful to point out and on it seems like every 3rd chapter, there'll just be a little one-page interval that simply says, "And don't trust anything that I just said,"
Yes.
because it's all interpretation, and it is such a wealth of characters, in Renaissance Italy, of dynamics in Renaissance Italy. Every new generation can look at this tremendously fervent, contradictory, complicated time and extract their own story about why, what it means. And so I believe that there actually was something
Special.
important important that changed in these centuries in Italy. But you can actually make a case, and Ada Palmer doesn't go this far, but I do think you can make a case that much like the history of ancient Greece and Rome, it's important because everybody
Looks at it. Everybody thinks it's important.
everybody thinks it's important, everybody has thought it was important for 500 years. So there's that layer of it's just important because people thought it was important and kept on going back to these writers, going back to this history and reinterpreting it. But I think I actually am enough of a unrevised fan of history that I do actually believe that something really important happened in
Does
Renaissance
she
Italy.
mention the Byzantines in her book? Because she didn't, and that's some people use this as an example, or like say that as a reason why the Renaissance happened.
Oh, yeah, she definitely talks about that in her book, yeah.
Okay, she didn't in that just that podcast you
Yeah,
sent me.
yeah, yeah. No, she covers that
Because
massively.
one theory I have, it's almost feel like it's the Roman Empire coming home. Because some people believe the Byzantines is you could still consider it to be the Roman
Mhm.
Empire.
Sure.
So the idea when it collapsed, some of its ideas then came back to Italy. So it's almost like a, you know, what do you call it? A homecoming for a lot of these ideas.
So I guess we should probably get into like what was Italy back then? We did
Hmm.
a podcast talking about the 1800s and sort of the 1700s, 1800s, and focusing on how Italy sort of managed to unify itself without actually succeeding much or what have you, like just sort of a unending series of catastrophes from Napoleon through Mussolini that somehow ended up with a successful, happily unified Italy. That was not the case, during the period of the Renaissance. So, the whole concept of looking at history as there were the ancient times, and then there were the Dark Ages, and then there was us, which is the modern times. The actual term Renaissance, I think, is much newer, but in the 1300s in Italy, there was a bunch of guys who were already thinking about themselves as we're new and different and modern. Like this is something that's different. There was the old Roman times that was really cool, and then there's a whole bunch of crap in the middle, and then there's us, and we are creating something new and better, something new. And the whole like fixation on a golden age, the whole fixation on things being amazing which Ada Palmer kind of does an amazing job of exploding very quickly. The lived experience, especially for the famous people that we think about, where we think about the Borgias, Lucretia Borgia, her brother, their father, the Pope, which is, isn't generally how you understand these things supposed to be working. Michelangelo, Machiavelli, all of these people were, Leonardo, Donatello, as she says in the podcast, all the Ninja Turtles,
Hmm.
like all of these folks sort of lived in a period that was nightmarish, like just plague, war, famine, destruction. It was like a very, very, very rough
But did people
time.
come to Italy to fight, was she saying?
Oh, absolutely.
But it was saying like the English and the Scottish would fight in Italy because it was nicer to fight there. It seemed very bizarre.
Because it was so much richer. And this actually gets to your question about the Byzantines. If you look at Italy, the powers in Italy were the Papal States, so Rome and the territory around it. Was controlled by the Pope. One of the things that was so disturbing, and actually in part helped to prompt the Reformation, was the fact that the popes were not just the spiritual leaders of most of Europe; they also were local lords. She's got this great formulation in the book of battle popes. So Julius II is
Back when they did have battalions.
yes, exactly. The popes really had battalions. Is that the Stalin quote?
Yes,
Yeah,
how many
yeah.
battalions has he got?
Exactly. So the battle popes were very important and were setting up their own kingdom. You also had Florence. This is the third book that I'm reading on the Renaissance over the past month is Florence and the Forgotten Centuries. This was recommended by Ada Palmer in her book, and it is fascinating. But Florence, the city that we have you been to Florence? It's sort of on the standard it's been on the standard tour of Italy since the 1700s when large-scale tourism to Italy, or at least elite tourism to Italy started. Florence was its own sort of power. Milan was its own sort of power.
Atreus is apparently another big one.
Not I
Not quite
mean,
at this
so
era.
I'm trying to think who Trieste was controlled by at this point, but it was not a huge
Okay.
dynamic. Would that have been Ottoman at this point? But to get to your question about the Byzantines, I would argue probably the largest power was Venice.
Hmm.
And Venice is fascinating because you look
In the lagoon.
indeed, the lagoon. Venice's wealth, initially through commercial means, and then eventually because Venice conquered Byzantium in the 1202, the famous Fourth Crusade. The famous horses of St. Mark on the Venetian cathedral, St. Mark's for the central square, those horses were stolen from during the Venetian sack of Constantinople in the 1200s. The Turks famously took Constantinople in 1453, but the real destruction of the antique wealth of the Eastern Roman Empire was carried out by the Venetians and sort of the Normans, or French more broadly, the Latins they call them, in 1202. The Greeks did manage to make it back into the city in 1260 or thereabouts. So whether it was through trade or conquest, Italy was the source of, or at least had the most wealth in Europe by far in like so the 1200s. You had famously, I think not one but two members of the Medici family. This is the family that ruled Florence, the Medicis, rich, wealthy as the Medicis, or this famous family that was wealthy through banking and then managed to become nobility. They were from Florence, yet they were ended up, I think, did they have two queens of France? Because just this individual town in Italy could intermarry with the royal families of France, because that's how rich and powerful each individual town in Italy. So to answer your other question, that's why the French and the Germans and the Spanish were fighting so hard to control Italy, is because it was so wealthy. And there are a number of things that went into that. It was the connection to the Byzantine Empire, and then eventually the connection to the Ottoman Empire, that all of the spices and luxury goods that were used across Europe until the Portuguese and the Spanish started figuring out how to sail around the world, went through Italy. And this is like a chicken or an egg thing. And this is what I find really, really attractive and interesting about as a sort of small R Republican in the way that I think about a lot of things. You know, I'm concerned about the existence of the United States as a republic, as a place with representative institutions, is that, and this is also why a lot of these city states were so enamored of the classical tradition, Florence in particular, is because these city states had more representative forms of government that can be dramatically oversold. Like, and Ada Palmer does a great job of pointing out, it's like, yeah, like this was a tiny elite oligarchy on top of these cities, but we shouldn't let that distract us from the fact that they really were something distinct from, and I would argue better than,
What came before?
yeah, monarchies or aristocracies. One of the really interesting things about Florence is that they actually executed all of their aristocrats at
Oh
some
yeah, when
point.
they first was it not when they kind of first overthrew them? That's what they did to sort of say they're starting a whole new type of governing.
That's my sense. I couldn't find too much, like, on this exactly, but there's a in the era that we're talking about, which is like the late 1400s, early 1500s specifically, which Ada Palmer focuses on, but for a few centuries before that, you actually couldn't have power in Florence if you were an aristocrat. And she talks about certain families who were raised as aristocrats, had an aristocratic history, but had to, like, hide it or lie about it and pretend to be
Something else.
sort of bourgeoisie, which is kind of fascinating. And my classic narrative of decline of Florence specifically, that I still believe in, though I think Ada Palmer would sort of critique it, is that Florence was at the center of European politics. You know, they're sending their and of course, these periods of time are different. And this is one of the great things that Ada Palmer complains about is we're like, yes, the Italian Renaissance that, you know, took place at some point between, you know, 1300, 1250 and 1600. It's like this vast gulf of time. But I do think I can make an argument that Florence was more vibrant, more powerful, more at the center of European politics when it was still trying to maintain a republican form of government, a more representative form of government. This book goes through the period, it's the forgotten centuries, which is kind of fascinating.
Okay.
The Italian Renaissance, Florence specifically, is central to the minds of a lot of people in Europe and the United States and now China and the rest of the world because it's so well preserved. And I think, as I've talked about before, is like if a place is incredibly well preserved, it means that not much was happening there in the intervening centuries. Like if you can go to Florence, which you can to some extent, and kind of experience, Ada Palmer talks about going down to that central piazza in Florence, and you can look up at the Palazzo Vecchio, the old palace, and you can see the office that Machiavelli sat in when he was trying to manage Florence's diplomacy. So if you've got a place where you can still walk through the streets, see a lot of the stuff that you could see 500 years ago, it means that economic activity and change kind of stopped.
Okay, because was one of her points not that if you have somewhere that's almost so beautiful, so wonderful, when people take you over, they're like, we want to keep that city, so we'll keep that nice.
Oh, that's a huge dynamic, and she makes the larger argument that the reason so much has survived in Italy is that, like, the French, I mean, the Normans, the French, the
The Holy Roman Empire.
yes, the folks that took it over were always much more careful to preserve what was there than they were other places. I mean, a classic example that she doesn't get into too much in the book, but, the Renaissance spread in different ways. She speaks very movingly about the way that the high level of culture that they had attained was instantly impressive to the aristocracies throughout the rest of Europe, and that, like, they would, like, come in and be like, "Oh, crap, like, how are these bankers living at a much higher standard of living than we are? And we want that, we want that." And one of the great, like, lost stories of the Renaissance is the King of Hungary. And what happened to Budapest was it was fought over by the Turks and the Holy Roman Empire for gosh, 300 years or at least 100 years. And his beautiful Renaissance palaces and his, libraries were destroyed and dispersed. And if you go to Hungary today, you can see beautiful, I think, is it their parliament, or is there a palace that's just absolutely gorgeous on the riverside, and there's beautiful buildings, but it's all like 1700s, 1800s stuff, because the beautiful 1400s, 1500s stuff at the basement of one of the castles, you're like, well, that's one column that was from that, but it all got destroyed. So Ada Palmer is careful to emphasize that part of the reason why we care so much about Florence is because it was successfully preserved.
Do you think much of if someone took over America, do you think much of it would be preserved?
Let's First, I'd have to imagine some entity that could
Mhm.
take over America is the sort of the
Yeah.
difficulty there. And it's not. I think certainly conquest is a huge part of the horrors of conquest, of destruction and whatnot, but also economic dynamism is a really big part of it. If you walk the streets of Florence, you can imagine, for a lot of walking around Florence, you can imagine, what this all looked like 500, 600 years ago. If you walk around Milan or Genoa, there's certainly cathedrals and lots of old buildings that are preserved, but these were places that I think maintained a higher level of economic dynamism than Florence did. So you don't have like the comprehensive, like Florence, every church you duck into has a 6 to 800 year old fresco or something like that. Whereas Milan and Genoa and Rome, certainly Rome, more than, Rome times 1,000, had a lot more going on economically in all of the centuries, especially the 19th and 20th centuries, than Florence did. So, absolutely, it's the dynamic of being preserved from conquest, but it's also the dynamic of being preserved from big economic dynamism. And the dynamic that I believe, it was funny, I started reading this book, which talks a lot about how the first Medici family member, well, not the f that made the full jump from just being a rich guy
Mhm.
to being a duke, to
Okay.
being a royal who could marry his family members into the French royal family. And it's interesting because, especially after reading Ada Palmer's book and, like, jumping into this and the first duke, it's confusing because the founder of the Medici family in, like, the 1300s is Cosimo the Elder, and this guy was a banker who was very keen to point out that he was not aristocratic because the Florentine Republic didn't like that. That's in like I think he died probably in the mid 1300s or mid 1400s. By the mid 1500s, this guy wanted to set himself up as a duke. And it's confusing because Cosimo the Elder, like I think the father, or was it the grandfather of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who is like the famous, like, Renaissance Prince of Florence or what have you. His name is Cosimo. And then there's Cosimo the First in the mid 1500s, who is the Grand Duke. And what he did was after an incredibly tumultuous, horrifically violent time that prompted Machiavelli to write The Prince, which is famously a somewhat morally dubious set of advice for princes and rulers. How do you survive this incredibly difficult time? The Grand Duke Cosimo the First came in and managed to sort of secure a sort of peace. The problem was he secured a sort of peace and turned Florence into the capital of Tuscany, a broad chunk of the Italian boot, more successful territorially than the Florentine Republic had ever been, but that quickly led to stagnation. And the success in bringing about peace and stability of Cosimo the First between, like, the 1530s, extraordinarily long reign, the 1530s and the 1560s, I believe, brought peace to Florence, but it also eventually brought stagnation. And that's sort of how the story of European power sort of moved on from Italy to France and the United Kingdom and eventually Germany. And it's a fascinating story of how it's similar to the way that I look at the Roman Empire and the way that I'm beginning to look at the United States today, which is dynamism and friction and the growing power of a more representative form of government that allows flux and growth and just dynamism, greatness, for lack of a better term. And then it sort of ends up ossifying and collapsing. Ada Palmer points out that's actually not what these Renaissance guys were thinking about.
Oh
They
yeah,
weren't
yeah. They
thinking,
seemed to be quite terrified and thought they were living in desperate times.
but that's also not what they looked. That's not what they admired about Rome. They didn't want the dynamic republic. They wanted.
The peaceful republic. They talked about coming from like France all the way to Rome and not being mugged when you're carrying gold. That's what they wanted to recreate.
Yes, that's what they wanted to recreate, but crucially, that's not the republic. That's the empire. Ada Palmer, I guess not even really controversially at this point, but somewhat cheekily calls the four good gay emperors, because they were all pretty famously into
Because
dudes.
I think the Roman Empire was a lot more gayer than like we've been led to believe.
Well, I think the appropriate way to say it would be that their idea of gay and straight and hetero and homosexual was just completely different from ours
But I think,
today.
yeah, whatever we were sort of previously taught is they seem to be a lot more liberal and a lot more okay with what our common idea of homosexuality would be.
Yeah, I think one of the most common statues of all like Roman statues that have
Hmm.
survived is I can't. It's a something.
Recording Ruri here. You are correct, Rob. His name does begin with A. It's Antinous.
Hadrian had a boyfriend who died, a much younger man, and he was so bereft
Yeah.
that he built hundreds, if not thousands, of statues
Wow.
of his dead boyfriend. And I think I could be wrong about this, but it's certainly one of the most common, best represented people we have
Of ancient
from
Rome.
from ancient Rome, because Hadrian really
And I
missed.
think it was quite common to have like poets to commission things for your boyfriend and stuff. So yeah, it's a lot gayer than say we previously thought.
Yes, but so Ada Palmer's formulation is the good gay emperors, which is an interesting way to put it. But the ideal of the four good emperors goes back to Edward Gibbon and probably long before that. These are the four emperors after the Julio-Claudian dynasty. This is like it ends with Gladiator, which is kind of funny. The last of them is Marcus Aurelius.
Mhm.
I obviously would not. Certainly not the second one, nor the first Gladiator film, but the run of emperors from, was it Trajan? I think I'm getting the sequence wrong, but it goes, is it Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius? Who's the best? Antoninus Pius is the best of the four good emperors because we know nothing about him.
Oh, so he couldn't do anything wrong.
Well, no, that's the thing. There's nothing exciting. He reigned for like, I don't know, 10, 20 years.
Well, it's a bit
and
like the thing, may you not live in interesting times.
Exactly. There's nothing that we don't know anything about him because like there were no
Just the
wars.
economy just idled over.
There were no wars, there was no chaos, there was no destruction. So yeah. So that was actually not, they didn't look to the dynamism of the Roman Republic. These early Renaissance thinkers, what they were looking toward was just the peace and prosperity of the four good emperors between I think it ended in like the 160s or the 180s.
Nero?
What's that?
Sorry, you go on.
No, Nero was definitely not one of the four good emperors.
No.
I can say that with great satisfaction. There's the initial Julio-Claudian dynasty, which sort of started by Augustus and then ends up in a succession of pretty crap guys like Caligula and Nero, and a lot of people don't like Tiberius either. And then a bunch of generals who adopted their successors. So basically found really talented people to be the next emperor. And that was like a good run of a century there. And Edward Gibbon in the 1700s famously said this was probably the best time to be a human being ever, which I think we've since superseded. What's endlessly fascinating about Renaissance Italy to me is just the idea that such compact groups of people could have such a lasting influence on such larger groups of people.
Yeah.
I mean, Florence in the 1500s, I don't know what the population was, but wasn't more than 50,000 people. Yet the artists, the political theorists like Machiavelli, the scientists, Galileo was a Florentine, the guy who sort of redefined how the solar system worked for us, following Copernicus. Like, just tremendous influence. And this Ada Palmer sort of mocks the idea that, modern capitalism was built in these places, but I think there's a Marxist historian who I read last year called Giovanni Arrighi, maybe I'm mispronouncing it, Arrighi, I think, who makes a pretty strong case that the financial leadership of first Europe and then the world has transferred in a fairly violent and destructive, but almost orderly process from Renaissance Italy. You had sort of Venice and Florence and these other city-states, Venice, Florence, Genoa, Milan, the Papal States, Naples, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, or sort of Naples, came under sort of foreign control earlier than all the city-states. I think it was the Normans, and then it was the Spanish, and then it was some combination thereof. Eventually, what happened to all of these Italian city-states is they fell under the control of outside powers. Genoa managed to keep things going for a good time longer by becoming kind of the bankers of the Spanish state, of the sort of Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs, what have you. Their financial leadership of the continent was superseded by the Dutch up in Amsterdam, who eventually are sort of the forerunners of the British in extending the European financial system to the world more broadly.
Because it's seen once they're sort of going across the Atlantic, then the flow of trade has moved from Italian directions to sort of that region.
Absolutely, the Spanish,
And also because you're getting a lot from the Baltic, from Russia, Sweden, that sort of direction, and then they all kind of meet in the Netherlands.
absolutely. So that's the Habsburgs were, for a period of time, you had Germany and Spain under the Habsburg family. Then Charles V in the 1500s decides this is a little too much to manage, but the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire are sort of working together for about a century after that. And what the Spanish are doing is sort of cutting out the Italians. So the Genoese were very smart, becoming the bankers for the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire that were kind of killing their trade monopoly. So it goes from the Dutch, and then it goes to the British, and then it goes to the Americans. And I think actually Giovanni Arrighi was arguing that very strongly before he died that it was then going to go to the Chinese. And I think it's not happening as quickly as he was anticipating, but he could actually be right about that. And I think that Arrighi's approach is a little too direct, a little too oversimplifying, and I think that Ada Palmer's book, Inventing the Renaissance, which I would recommend to everybody, is a great corrective to like these oversimplifying narratives. But it's just, I can't emphasize enough how useful it is.
But it seems like it's quite refreshing, this book, because instead of just going, here's a very specific part of history and I know everything and you, the reader, don't know much, she feels like she's a bit like taking you along, kind of going like, this is what I know, but you can interpret things whatever way. And golden ages are a bit of a myth that generally just great men come up with because they're really interested in the Aztecs.
Yeah. So
it'll be like one weird bit of history someone's obsessed with, and that's a golden age to them.
So what's so great about Ada Palmer's book is it does something that can often be, I never think it is, but that can often be seen as rather boring, which is the term is historiography. It is basically talking about the history of histories. Just going through, okay, so, and we see this, like, the great example would be in 2020 as we started looking a little, in the height of the Black Lives Matter stuff, we started looking at a lot of figures with in American history, like with a little darker sense than we might have otherwise. And that happens, that's a more extreme example, like all of a sudden people wanted to take Woodrow Wilson's name off of things, not because, he essentially, to my mind, jumped into World War I and created Hitler, but because, he was kind of racist, so they want to start taking his names off of
Mhm.
things. But what Ada Palmer does a great job of pointing out, specifically by talking about the figure of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who is this, this sort of central figure of the Florentine Italian Renaissance, and how every book has a different picture of Lorenzo de Medici. It depends on what year, what century that book was written in. What do you think of a figure like Lorenzo the Magnificent? Typically, a lot of people like me who see more value in the Florentine Republic and don't like the fact that it eventually became a duke with Medici's on top, don't like Lorenzo the Magnificent because he's like a key step. He's an intervening step between the banker's republic and the straight up aristocratic duke who's marrying into royal families. So I'm not such a big fan of Lorenzo the Magnificent. But then say you come to the Renaissance mostly because you love art, and Lorenzo the Magnificent was one of the most magical patrons of some of the greatest Renaissance art possible. So you really love Lorenzo the Magnificent. Or maybe you think that Florence finally got peace and prosperity under the dukes. So you really like Lorenzo because of that. So, and it's
Mhm.
what's so cool about this book, Inventing the Renaissance, is that she kind of takes a much more high-minded, professional approach to what she's talking about than like that atrocious book I read, the William Manchester book, The World Lit Only by Fire, or
Mhm.
any number of other books. But she also manages to do that while making it pretty fun and approachable. Like it's not a short book. It's not a short book, but it is a light read. She keeps it interesting.
Do you think that's because she also does like sci-fi? She tries to make optimistic sci-fi. Do you think the fact she's able to sort of like expand outside of like this one specific bit, she can take you on a bigger journey?
So I think yeah, I think absolutely. But I think she's a very serious scholar of Renaissance history
Oh yeah, yeah, quite the
at
academic.
the University of Chicago, which is maybe doesn't have the brand of like a Harvard or a Yale, but is one of the, never mind their horrific economics department. But it is one of the better brands in one of the better universities in the
Would you
country.
say it's better for getting a good education and less, you know, connections and stuff like those other universities?
My friends who went to the University of Chicago would tell you that. The
Mhm.
University of Chicago is actually famously, I don't know if they still market it this way, but it was the university where fun goes to die. It's apparently it is a much more rigorous.
Okay.
I remember I had a cousin who went to the University of Chicago, and I will always remember she had a wedding. And for a lot of people in the United States who go to university, the year after university is a real shock because like the party's over and there's no summer coming, and
Knuckle down and work.
you have to be in, my first job after college, I did not have vacation for 2 years. That's just, something they do to young people in the United States. And then all the people from the University of Chicago were like, "Oh my God, I'm so happy I'm out of college. Like everything's easy. I only have to work like 80 hours a week now. Everything's easy." So yeah, the University of Chicago is a very serious institution. Ada Palmer is a very serious scholar, and she's also written what is probably my favorite. I don't know. Adrian Tchaikovsky's up there, but one of my favorite sci-fi series of the decade, the Terra Ignota series, which is brilliant and actually does talk about a lot of this stuff. In the sci-fi series, she talks about like 400 years from now, like the world has actually kind of lived in a completely peaceful utopia for a number of centuries. It is not a democracy, though there are elements. Which I'd never really thought about that before. It is very interesting. There's kind of like a Pope analog. There's kind of I hadn't really thought about how Terra Ignota is basically Renaissance Italy, but now that I think about it a little further, though, of course, like there's the king of the EU
Okay.
is a character, and basically it's about the utopia falling apart and how that all goes. And I actually kind of want to go back and reread it.
But she's also very affable. She comes off very well on this podcast. She isn't just like incredibly, stern and just throwing off facts.
Well, and that's the beauty of the approachability of this book is that it's fun, and the chapters are short, and she's very clear, and she gets into some very deep issues of, like, ethical philosophies. On some level, the book is kind of like a long defense of Machiavelli,
Okay.
which is kind of interesting, and we frankly don't have the time, to
Well,
get
it
into.
was her point basically he was just trying to he was doing whatever to save the city.
Yes, that is her main point.
And then once he realized certain things weren't the way of doing it, then he would change his positions and stuff. So he would see that he was actually, quite peaceful and good.
I think Machiavelli has a reputation of the classic formulation is what it's better to be feared than loved, or what have you. And as Ada Palmer emphasizes in the book, it's like he was educated to the extent that he was, one of the most educated men in European history since the Roman times.
Mhm. Well, that was the big thing. It was the idea that these powerful people should be educated, and they were, and it was a complete disaster. And they didn't seem to have the same honor and beliefs that they were expected to have.
Well, no, it just didn't work out the way that they had hoped, I think.
Yes.
And I think that Machiavelli had realized, and in the book, Ada Palmer just goes through like his continual surprise that a certain figure, Cesare Borgia, I just learned that you're supposed to say Cesare instead of Cesare. Podcasts, you can learn things. Was a just monstrous, monstrous figure, and Machiavelli watched his development, actually survived a famous massacre that Borgia had carried out, because Machiavelli was there, and Borgia was like, "Oh, well, you're not one of the people I have to kill," but, or what have you. Saw that he actually got closer to successfully asserting Italian power than most others had, so he wanted to distill these lessons, and in the process, many would argue, kind of invented the modern discipline of political science. But I think that gets to that sort of like golden age issue, and actually kind of an issue I have with Ada Palmer's book, is that what we know about the Renaissance, the famous parts of the Renaissance, I think apparently I knew of at least one of them, but Ada Palmer refers to another one. Apparently, over the past 10 years, or maybe 15 years, there have been two separate premiere television, prestige TV series about the Borgias alone. This is
Hmm.
the Pope, whose kids, one of whom inspires the prince, and the other of whom has inspired centuries of lurid stories about her love life or what have you. This was all kind of after the part that mattered, to my mind. I am much more interested in the centuries that led up to that 1400s, 1500s extraordinary Leonardo Machiavelli, Raphael, that extraordinary era, because this is kind of the point, and I think Ada Palmer makes that pretty clear. This is kind of the point where it all came crashing down. This is the point at which the Italian city-states that had been so powerful and so prosperous started really, really losing out to the Germans, the Spanish, and the
Mm.
French. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. She does tremendously useful work in exploding a lot of the myths about this period, but it's actually much quieter earlier decades and centuries, and places without the high profile artistic legacy that I think are kind of what really made the Italian Renaissance as powerful as it was. I think this point where everything's sexy and fun and everything's blowing up, that you can make good prestige TV out of, is kind of when the ship was already sailing. I mean, keep in mind, so it's not exactly one to one, but like I think you've got, when is Vasco da Gama? I think is one of the guys who started the successful Portuguese exploitation of India and Asia. And then, of course, I think that's the 1480s. And then, of course, in 1492, you've got Columbus sailing the ocean blue. So it's a lot of this. This is kind of the point at which Florence and Renaissance Italy kind of lost it. I think Ada Palmer kind of documents that very well, but I think she also still has a tremendous affection
For this
for this
period.
era and for this period of time, which I now share and is now accelerating because of this book. I mean, I'm now on my third Renaissance book over the past month, when I should really be reading about a lot of other stuff. My current book project, I'm kind of hung up on the Great Depression in the United States in the 1930s. So perhaps I should not be reading so much about the Italian Renaissance right now, but gosh darn it, it's fascinating stuff. And I do see there are universals here. There are just the ideas of, it's not so much the ideas of a golden age or dark ages, but ideas of dynamism and stagnation.
Do golden ages always have to mean that you're the dominant power, or could you have multiple golden ages going on at the same time? Or
Oh, 100%. So I mean, what is a golden age? Like, what is it is a, so what I didn't understand from the book that I do absolutely understand from the podcast is that she started writing this book because during COVID, people would come up to her and keep asking this question, which was, well,
oh yes, yes.
now that we've had COVID,
Hmm.
does that mean that we're going to have a golden age? Because one very simple and incorrect estimation is that the Renaissance was produced by the Black Death, by a
Well,
massive plague.
it was sort of horrible the way they said it. It was like, oh, will this mean the markets are going to be good? And it was so like, ugh, so blunt, because I'd heard that it would help the working class because if, if the balance had been shifted and there's less workers, you'll have to pay the existing workers more to keep them because there's just less about. But yes, there's this idea that then it kind of reestablished the status quo and brought about a renaissance.
Well, so that's I think a largely debunked thing. So I think there was absolutely a set of data at some point over the past 50 years that indicated that a bunch of serfs in some section of Europe, I think probably somewhere in England, were better off after the Black Death because they were able to negotiate better strategies. But then there's actually other parts of Europe where the nobles were successful in shutting down a lot of things.
Rebellions.
Yeah, where it actually used the Black Death to create a even more repressive system of government. So there's a lot of things that go into that sort of
It's a bit
assumption.
like the Protestant worth ethic was all based on like one German village, and it turns out it's not quite true.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of very attractive ideas. But so to your question about like what is a golden age? I mean, were like the 1920s a golden age in the United States with that stock market? Because that's certainly the parallel that I don't recall running up into that question like, the parallel between COVID and the Black Death before. But what I had run into and thought about myself and might even have made a video about at some point, a short or something, was this idea that actually the Spanish flu in the late 19 teens might have led to the Roaring 20s, which was seen as a good economic decade in the United States. And I think the parallels were obvious, and there were financial journalists talking about that. Well, okay, we had COVID. Are we going to have a Roaring 20s in
In the 20s.
Turns out, no. It actually, or in recent months, studied the 1920s in the United States in some detail. Those actually weren't very roaring either.
Well, that's another thing she talks about is quite often when you look at these golden ages, it's like, is the average person better off? Because quite often they're worked hard and miserable. And if you were to be teleported into a lot of these golden ages, the average person might have been better off in a period of time that's quite boring and no one talks about, like, say, the Dark Ages.
Well, I think a point that she makes is that golden ages are almost always talked about in retrospect. There are certainly people in the Renaissance who consciously wanted to rebuild a golden age or put the circumstances in place for a better world or what have you. But it's only in retrospect when we look at all the magnificent art that we're like, that must have been a golden age. It's a golden age for this, that, and the other thing. And I mean, just like personally, and I think we've talked about this, like there are tremendously successful beneficiaries operating at the highest point throughout any, plausible golden age in human history. The biggest beneficiaries, the biggest, most productive people who are freaking miserable the whole time.
Yeah.
Like it's not like what is a golden age? Like it's not. It is it's a very attractive idea, and I am grateful to Ada Palmer for undermining this. The next book that I read after Ada Palmer was this just horrible William Manchester book. I'd actually read a William Manchester book about the Krupps, a family of German arms manufacturers that tracks them from I think actually the Renaissance through the 20th century when the book was written after World War II. And I actually found that very useful and interesting treatment of a subject. Having read his book on the Renaissance, I am now thinking perhaps I should forget everything I read in his other books. He's also a very famous, quite literal a lionizer of Winston Churchill. I think his big project was a multi-volume biography of Winston Churchill, The Last Lion, or something along those lines.
So it would appear he maybe wasn't as great as everyone thought.
Yeah, and I was really disturbed to find that this William Manchester book that I had picked up, in his preface, he points out that he kind of wrote this as a lark in between his more serious books.
Okay.
And this is as I believe an old man in declining health, and I'd have some sympathy for how bad this book is if it hadn't gone on to be a massive bestseller. It's apparently one of the greatest best-selling books of history of the 1990s, and I was able to find it on a shelf in a used bookstore.
Does it sort of promote like a I find books like that almost like they're promoting an idea at the time they say the Republicans want it. It's like, oh, this reinforces this bill you want to pass that just happens to coincide with history that I've written to be like that.
I think he was probably a conservative-ish politician. If he had political views, they were conservative-ish in the age of Thatcher and before that. I don't think there was any particular, like, short-term partisan thing. It's basically just gassing up Western civilization and a certain narrative of Western civilization. And maybe I would have liked Manchester's book better if I hadn't just finished Ada Palmer's book, because it's like Ada Palmer, like, carefully looks at the figure of the way that her book works is she tells the lives of, I think, 15 Renaissance people, and, like, is very careful to be like, well, this is what some people think. People who want the Renaissance to be all about secularism look at this person this way, and people who want the Renaissance to be all about the value of individualism look at this person that way. And one of the people that she does the biography of is this figure, Lucretia Borgia, who was the daughter of a pope, which is also, it's kind of strange,
Yes.
but was a thing that was not unheard of in the Renaissance, and who became very important in politics and then became much less important in politics. And Palmer suggests that her husband actually killed her by impregnating her. Essentially it was like, okay, well, if I just keep getting her pregnant, I'll get more kids, and then eventually she'll die, and it worked, which is kind of horrifying.
But sadly was a common thing to happen to, people of nobility.
It was new to me, and it was a pretty horrific suggestion.
You haven't watched House of the Dragon?
Apparently not. I watched the first season of that. I thought it was interesting. It was kind of a horrifying suggestion, and she makes the case that Lucretia Borgia was on the losing side of a power struggle, and therefore a lot of nasty stories about her became part of our sense of history because, her faction lost. And then just to read William Manchester's book where he's just like, yes, Lucretia Borgia had a child with her father, like, just like,
Oh.
and it's just like, whoa. And I did some further research and they're like, yeah, this is like a famous slander of her, and I'm not asserting that, and nor does Ada Palmer assert that, like, Lucretia Borgia was this, like, spotless, like, great person. But yeah, the William Manchester book gives a version of history that I think is very familiar to, I think, sort of grade school history, which is basically, it's kind of interesting because it's nominally a book about the Italian Renaissance or Renaissance more broadly, but it's actually more about the Reformation, which
Okay.
is a religious dynamic. It's getting started in Germany, but actually had a significant impact throughout Italy and everywhere else in Europe. But it is kind of this, like, potted version of European history where it's like, we had the Renaissance after the Middle Ages, and then the Reformation, broke up Christendom, and then we had the Enlightenment, and then we had nationalism, and then we had modern times. And it's just this
So it's
incredibly
not really challenging any views you have.
yes, it's just this incredibly simplified And if you have a more sophisticated view of this, which you can glean reading Ada Palmer's book, it is infuriating. It's like basically like what if you read a really complex technical treatise on something and then watched like an incorrect YouTube how-to video. That was sort of that's what it is moving from Ada Palmer to William Manchester here. And it is fascinating history because the questions that are being dealt with the Renaissance are some of the biggest. What is a golden age? What is stagnation? What is dynamism? What are the very real elements of historical development that brought us the Europe and the United States of today? What was put in place that led to the period of European and American dominance that is now ending? Like, it's all just incredibly important, fascinating stuff. And I could not recommend highly enough this book in particular, the Ada Palmer's book in particular, but also just learning more about this period of time. There's plenty of salacious stuff, there's plenty of beautiful art, but it's also just one of the key sets of stories about how we got here to who we
But
are.
also, I think one of her things was basically measure golden ages in centuries, because so often people seem to, it's like they kind of expect a golden age to be like 5 years. They want to go, oh, this thing happened and I can make an investment now. But it's like quite often these people don't know they're in a golden age. Stuff's happening. So I think another part was like something terrible is happening. So we have to try new things to survive. So only in retrospect can you look back and see all the wonderful things. But at the time, it was just survival.
Well, yeah, and that's if your period of time is producing great works of art, it's actually not necessarily the best of times. And the when she mentioned that on the podcast, what I thought of was actually the 1970s in the United States are seen as a golden age
For cinema.
for cinema and for music.
Hmm.
Just incredible peak. I mean, and of course, a lot of that is this is when baby boomers were kids, and baby boomers have been cultural arbiters ever since. So, when the baby boomers were young. But anyway, but yeah, but the 1970s were a very unhappy time.
Well, quite often it was because there was a lot of the films had flopped. They were big budget films in the 60s. So there was no money. So you had a lot of people making very cheap, sort of slightly surreal films like Taxi and stuff that do show just how horrible it kind of was at the time.
Well, I mean, there's the Godfather films. I don't think those were particularly. I don't know the details of like the breakdown of the studio system or what have you. But for whatever reason, 1970s music and cinema is pretty great.
Well, I was going to ask, do you have any like not secret golden ages, but is there any periods in time or countries that you think that's a golden age, but a lot of people wouldn't appreciate it?
Well, so one thing that's important, I do believe there are elements of how we got to modernity in Renaissance Italy for sure. I do believe it is important. I do believe it is worth studying, but it is absolutely true that like because we decided it was important and it was a golden age. This isn't at all novel or actually I will get to I think a more novel interpretation. It is pretty well established among history nerds that in fact there was something else which is called what do they call it, the 12th century
Mm,
Renaissance. What's kind of interesting, especially going to the question that launched Ada Palmer's book, it's like, oh, did the Black Death, lead to the Renaissance Golden Age? I don't think many people would think that, but it's pretty well established that the Black Death ended a golden age, actually. A lot of
yeah.
the thinkers in 1300s, 1400s Florence were really invested in saying, the Middle Ages sucked. Everything back then was garbage. But if you actually look into it, before the Black Death in 1347, Europe reached peaks of population, prosperity, that they did not reach again until like the 1600s, or maybe even the 1700s. So actually, there was already a sort of golden age, a Renaissance means rebirth, a rebirth of ancient learning that actually led to a sort of snowballing intellectual rebirth that went far beyond what the ancients were talking about. Of course, the 1300s, 1400s Renaissance people hated that. They called it scholasticism. They thought it was garbage. They thought it was stupid and wrong. But honestly, it was deeply impressive and certainly laid a lot of the groundwork. If you go, that's the 12th century Renaissance. If you go 400 years before that, under Charlemagne in the 800s, or late 700s, 800s, there was actually another sort of intellectual rebirth, what have you. And my take is that in European history and historiography, we are really invested in this concept of like, oh, there was a golden age there that is worth sort of trumpeting, or maybe this is a different golden age. I would argue that all civilizations have gone through periods of time. I did a short recently about Ibn Khaldun, who is it's interesting, they don't call him a Renaissance thinker, even though he was writing at the exact same time based on a lot of the same thinkers, but he was in the Islamic world, not the European world, so he's different. But he had, I think arguably a much more sophisticated and long-lasting way of looking at things, arguing that it's part of the cycle of history, that you have periods of great flourishing that lead to wealth and intellectual growth that then get crushed by the barbarians outside.
Yeah.
And I think you can make a case that the significance of the Florentine or Italian Renaissance is that while the barbarians absolutely did come and crush it, they were less willing to stamp it out entirely. And that the sort of golden age, the gathering snowball of wealth and intellectual vigor, and as Ada Palmer says, just libraries being built everywhere, kind of continued on from the 1400s and 1500s in a much more recognizable way, whereas the 12th century Renaissance was truly crushed by the Black Death. The Charlemagne Renaissance was truly crushed by the Vikings. The Islamic golden ages were truly crushed by the Mongols. And the sort of Italian Renaissance didn't get crushed as, we talked about the Malian Empire had an intellectual golden age that was completely crushed by, honestly, maybe even the Black Death as well, but like the collapse of certain trade networks. So this is actually something that, Renaissances, golden ages, economic power leading to intellectual power that has the potential of becoming this growing snowball of societal rebirth and impressiveness has happened thousands of times. That we've never even paid attention to. What's, I think, perhaps unique about what has happened in Renaissance Italy is that we're still recognizably asking some of the same questions and thinking along of some of the same lines as they were as long ago as the 1250s in Florence and other places in Italy. And that, even if everything else, the sort of Marxist theories of cycles and ideals that Ada Palmer does a pretty good job of skewering, that like, oh, this is where individualism starts, this is where secularism starts, blah, 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 blah. Even if all of that is nonsense, like this is a place where a snowball of prosperity and intellectualism and good ideas started that hasn't stopped yet. And I think that is what makes the Italian Renaissance a different kind of golden age that is much more worthy of our attention and continues to be worthy of our attention. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Woohoo!
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.